Great start. Well, I'm here. I've been teasing this video for a while, and I'm sorry it took me a long time, but I've been in a bit of a weird place with this channel, at least as far as long-form content is concerned, and I'm very much thinking about the future direction of this channel and what I want to do with it. I will probably make a longer video about this because I have a lot of things I want to share and a lot of things I'm thinking about with the channel. You will see that video eventually, but for now, I've made you guys wait long enough. Let's finally do this. Welcome to what may or may not become the first in a series of videos, Discography Dive. It's exactly what it sounds like. I take an artist's discography, I go through it, I look at how they've changed, how they've not changed, how they've gotten better, gotten worse, or even just stayed the course. I'll let you in on one reason why this video took a while. Initially, the first episode of this series was going to be centered around Kanye West and his discography, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who doesn't want to talk about Kanye right now. I debated whether I was going to make that video, but then Kanye digging himself an even deeper hole made me think, nah, I'm gonna not do that, at least not right now. So I had to pivot to someone else, and that's what I'm doing with this video. As you can tell from the title, today we're going to be talking about Drake. You all know Drake by now, one of the biggest artists on the planet, if not the biggest, a Toronto rapper, singer who has certainly seen and done a lot in his career at this point. He's put out a lot of records, some great, some less great, some miserable. You either love him or hate him, but you can't deny how big of an artist he's become at this point. With this video, I'm gonna go through all of Drake's major projects, save for EPs just because there's so much less to say with those, and extremely early work that's much harder to find, and we'll see how much Drake has evolved, or in other cases, not evolved. So I don't want to waste any more time on this intro because we have a lot to cover. So let's dive in. I'm going to kick things off with a project, one of the few Drake projects that I have not formally reviewed, the 2009 mixtape So Far Gone. This was not Drake's first mixtape, as I'm sure many of you may know. He started with 2006's Room for Improvement before dropping Comeback Season in 2007, but I'm starting with this one because, well, for one thing, Drake doesn't even seem to want to act like those first two tapes exist because they haven't been reissued, but also this tape feels like the most important out of the three for obvious reasons. Beyond being his commercial breakthrough, it was a major sea change for the music world, whereas his first two tapes feel like mere footnotes in his career. In the case of So Far Gone, this was the project that helped establish Drake as a name to watch for, having just come off of joining Lil Wayne on his The Carter 3 tour in 2008. Wayne took a chance on Drake and offered him a prominent co-sign, and with this record, Drake in many ways helped change the way that hip-hop sounded back in 2009 and would go on to sound. Part of a three-headed monster of records that included Kid Cudi's Man on the Moon, The End of Day, and Kanye West's 808s and Heartbreak, Drake brought an R&B flavor to his blend of rap while also making songs that were a lot more emotional and self-deprecating. In a genre best known for macho flexing, Drake was a bit of an anomaly, but one the world couldn't help but pay attention to, and his early commercial success was proving that. Despite its incredible influence though, So Far Gone is the kind of record I feel like I appreciate more for its ideas and concepts as opposed to its execution. Don't get it twisted though, there are some beautiful emotional highlights. I can't tell you how many times I've replayed songs like Lust for Life, Sooner Than Later, Houston, Atlanta, Vegas, and especially Brand New, each of which have very spacey, ethereal production while Drake himself mixes nicely between solid rap flows and very nice singing. Similar thing with tracks like The Calm and Say What's Real without the singing in the case of the latter. That song also sees Drake drop one long, strong verse over Kanye's Say You Will instrumental, something that became a bit controversial when this tape was reissued in 2019 because of some beef that Drake and Kanye had at the time. You can see Drake's clear influence on this project, as it's been pointed out, but songs like A Night Off and Bria's interludes sound like what The Weeknd would go on to make with his breakthrough mixtapes, and this was months before Abel started anonymously posting his super early music online. There's also an emphatic banger here and there, like the classic single Best I Ever Had that brings some big time energy and emotion despite how fast paced the rapping is. Drake would also reissue some of these tracks as part of a So Far Gone EP, which I previously reviewed, and that was his first proper release under Young Money and Cash Money Records. He also included two new tracks, which were the absolute banger I'm Going In that I really enjoy, and the track Fear here, which has honestly really grown on me since my first listen. That said, there are a lot of moments on here where Drake goes down some routes that feel like they don't fit his style all that well. Tracks like the indie-leaning Let's Call It Off, the weirdly poppy Little Bit, and the more electronic Unstoppable that features a pretty annoying hook from Santa Gold and probably the worst of Lil Wayne's 4 appearances on this tape. It's either that or Uptown. I'm also not too big on his verse on Ignorant Shit either, to be honest, though that Jay-Z sample is a solid playground for the two of them to rip off some fast flows. And while Successful was a pretty big song with a pretty damn catchy Trey Songz hook, it's a track I've kind of struggled to come back to that often, as I find it a bit dull with a bit of a nothing Lil Wayne verse. Though that line from Drake where he says, "Diss me and you'll never hear a reply for it," feels like a perfect that aged like milk moment in Drake's catalog. Whatever that's worth. November 18th shows some good appreciation to the Houston style of rap, of DJ Screw's Chopped and Screwed style, but it's another moment that kind of drags a little bit for me. And while the instrumental outro by Chili Gonzalez is really beautiful and definitely a highlight, I'm glad Drake at least ended the standard edition with Brand New, which is perhaps my favorite track here, because on the reissue's closer, Congratulations, some of the weird vocal filters in the Coldplay Viva La Vida sample take me out of the song just a little bit. This is a record that, looking back, has some detours that don't work out, which is kind of natural given that it's a mixtape. A lot of times artists throw as many songs as they can on a mixtape since there isn't a label to be their quality control. And in this case, I think it helps that Drake really wanted to show everyone that not only was he a talented rapper, but that he had versatility to spare, hence why we had awkward genre transitions here and there. I also wonder if Drake had a flailing reliance on his mentor Lil Wayne on this project, given the latter's frequent appearances that at times can be a bit below par, especially given that the Wayne we're hearing here was coming off of the Carter 3. But with all that said, it's a record that I think deserves respect for how predictive it was and how massive of an influence it had on the future of hip-hop and R&B. And despite its inconsistency, there's enough here to make this a decent enough project, to the point where I'd at least give it an okay rating. It's not Drake's best, but there's a lot worth appreciating about the importance of this project, and there are enough highlights to make it worth a revisit for more than just historic reasons. Moving along, let's get into Drake's debut album, 2010's Thank Me Later. Beyond being highly anticipated by music fans, this album came at a time where Drake's bubbling up fame was starting to explode. The summer before this record's release, Drake was the topic of a massive bidding war, as that massively unique sound that came on So Far Gone, as well as his huge hits, turned him into one of the most coveted free agents in the music world. Something that he would allude to on his 2009 hit Forever with Kanye, Wayne, and Eminem, where he said, "Drop the mixtape, that shit sounded like an album, who'da thought a countrywide tour would be the outcome. Labels want my name beside an X like Malcolm, everybody got a deal, I did it without one." He would end up signing with Cash Money Records, Young Money Entertainment, and touring with the label, and this album would release in June 2010 after several delays. Now, I've devoted a review and a 10 years later video to this album, so there's obviously not a ton I can say about it that I haven't said already, but this is still a record I greatly enjoy coming back to very often. It honestly features some of my personal favorite Drake tracks that I've put on a constant loop time after time after time. The opener Fireworks that mixes singing with rapping phenomenally, and beautifully emotional songs like The Resistance, CeCe's Interlude, and especially Shut It Down, which was maybe my personal favorite #1 song from Drake for a while, weird lyrics about fine cousins and all. I sometimes tend to think that Drake's songs, especially the singy ones, can lack emotional impact these days, but that's why it's great to return to those tracks from this project, because they still sound awesome. There's also the wonderful pop single Find Your Love and the excellent banger Up All Night with Nicki Minaj that are still favorites of mine, and I think these continue to show the breadth of styles that Drake was able to handle without sounding as all over the place as So Far Gone did. And compared to my original review and the 10 years later video, it might have taken way too many listens, but overgrew on me enough to finally win me over. That song is definitely a huge banger. That said, while there are highlights here, there are still songs I don't find myself loving nearly as much. I still think Karaoke is a jarring moment on the record, and tracks like Unforgettable and Light Up still only really grab me with the nice melodies on their choruses. And there are tracks that, popular or not, I could take or leave on the record, like Show Me a Good Time, Fancy, Miss Me, and the album's closer, Thank Me Now. I know it might feel like I'm blowing through this particular part, but it's just because I've talked about this album and its songs plenty of times recently. I didn't feel as much a need to repeat myself. I'll once again say though that I quite enjoy Thank Me Later, especially as I've continued to listen to it. While So Far Gone might be the more influential project, I think Thank Me Later was a big improvement on it as it felt more consistent and cohesive as a whole. It still had a few downer tracks, but even most of those sound pretty good, and the high points are some of my personal favorites from Drake. I previously gave the album a good rating, but this was back before great was a part of my scale. I'd honestly be comfortable bumping it up to a great rating now, largely because the highs are just that good to me. It might not be Drake's peak album. Was it going to be? It's his first one. But it's a very enjoyable record with a lot of hidden gems in his discography. We've got a big one up next as it's time for Drake's 2011 album, Take Care. With Thank Me Later, Drake mentioned that he felt a bit disjointed when it came to the content on the record. That's a big part of why he called this one Take Care. He wanted to take his time with this one instead of rushing out a record to cash in on his popularity, and avoid that strike while the iron's hot mentality that Thank Me Later might have fallen into. Now, a lot of you probably know that this record is considered Drake's magnum opus, and having already reviewed the album and done a 10 Years Later video on it, you might know by now that I've considered this the best record that Drake has explicitly labeled as an album. Even though it's not my overall favorite Drake project, I think this is the record that was Drake's best blend of the hip-hop and R&B style. And while I might again gloss over it a little bit just because I've talked about it so many times already between my review and 10 Years Later, this seems to be one of those records that kind of gets better the more I listen to it. When I'm looking for the confident, boisterous rap jams, I always return to hits like Headlines, Crew Love with the legend himself, The Weeknd, and Practice. When I'm in the mood for more emotional downbeat songs, I've got Over My Dead Body, Shot For Me, Marvin's Room, and Doing It Wrong. And even though I haven't listened to these songs quite as much as the aforementioned ones, there are other fantastic cuts here that I love, like Kendrick Lamar's Buried Alive interlude, Lord Knows with Rick Ross, The Real Her with Wayne and Andre 3000, and Look What You've Done. After my 10 Years Later video, I also found that the two-part Cameras/Good Ones Go interlude medley really grew on me and became a huge favorite of mine. And even songs I wouldn't consider favorites I've gone back to for one reason or another. The title track Take Care, while I'm not crazy about because of the Gil Scott-Heron interlude, I come back to quite a bit because I love Drake's sing-rapping flow on the verses and Rihanna's chorus as well. And make me proud, while I talked a lot in my review in 10 Years Later about how I thought the chorus was awkward, I honestly find myself coming back to that hook a little bit. I can't put my finger on why, but as goofy as it sounds, it's pretty fun. Oh, and Nicki kills it on her verse. That's a big plus. Of course, there are still some songs I don't really care to return to at all, though I can't say I actively dislike them. This includes cuts like the decent but not as memorable Underground Kings, the weirdly offbeat and overly loud HYFR, Hell Yeah Fucking Right with Wayne, the decent but not quite as memorable album closer The Ride, and the somewhat awkwardly flowing Will Be Fine with Birdman that I'd still call my least favorite track on the album. But still, these are barely lowlights in my mind, not nearly bad enough to want to skip them, and the kind of cuts that would probably be high points if they were on modern Drake albums. Either way, as I said, this is my favorite Drake record that he's explicitly classified as an album, and it's easy to see why it's had the everlasting popularity that it's had. I feel like Drake took what he did with his first album and polished it to near perfection to make a record that stands out as a massive career high point. I'd obviously stand by the excellent rating that I've given it for all these years. It's definitely one of Drake's finest hours, and it's one of the first Drake albums I'd recommend to anyone in a heartbeat. Now let's get into another big one for Drake, his third studio album, 2013's Nothing Was the Same. During this record's creation, Drake talked about how he didn't want to make it a straight rap album, which it's not necessarily, but it's pretty damn close. To Drake, this was the most say the shit I need to say project up to that point, and it also felt like a bit more of a put the big boy pants on kind of project. He wanted to go for something a bit tougher, maybe in an attempt to prove himself as more than just the guy from the Charmin Ultra Soft memes that happens to rap and stuff. This was also a record I was extremely interested in going back to. When I first reviewed it back in 2018, I found it to be just okay. In comparison to Take Care, I thought this was just a whatever kind of album that had a fair few Drake songs I was just not crazy about at all. Sadly, while I had a better time with Nothing Was the Same this time around, I can't say I enjoyed it much more than I did back in 2018. There are definitely songs I come back to, like the poppier hit single Hold On We're Going Home, and the track Furthest Thing, which I'd probably say is my all-around favorite song off off of this project. In my initial listen and onward, I found myself very fond of the pumping but introspective opener Tuscan Leather, and some of these slightly lighter rap-focused songs like From Time with Jhené Aiko and Too Much with Sampha, as well as the bonus track Come Through with its lighter R&B vibes and slick beat switch. The other bonus track, All Me with 2 Chainz and Big Sean, also really grew on me with repeat listens, as it's definitely a banger among bangers with each artist pulling their weight and then some. All that said, this record does contain some of my least favorite Drake singles and moments that I am not nearly as crazy about compared to the rest of his discog. While it grew on me a bit and I probably wouldn't call it one of my least favorites anymore, I don't care much for Started From the Bottom. Same goes for tracks like The Language. I don't think it's a bad song, but I don't really feel as much when I listen to it. I also still think Wu-Tang Forever doesn't go all the way for me, as it's hard to get past the weird vocal filters at points and the verses not quite living up to the catchy crooning on the hook. Though I will disagree with 2018 Matt that the beat was generic, because the production is pretty damn nice. And while I like the ethereal vibe of the succeeding track Own It and the Guess Whose It Is of the hook, the effects on Party Next Door's vocals still take away from the track a bit for me, while Connect also has some references that feel specifically designed to appeal to the baseball fan in me. I find this to be rather boring and unexciting compared to the other tracks here. Worst Behavior still feels a bit toothless despite a clever beat and emphatic Drake performance, as it doesn't really show much Worst Behavior out of Drake, and with the constant start-stop flow, it doesn't really kick off until the final verse. Much like many others, I still find 305 to My City with Detail to be the worst song on the record. It's quite a snooze fest that just breaks the pace of the album. And while I absolutely love the instrumental on the first part of Pound Cake / Paris Morton Music 2, the second part doesn't really grab me as much, and it makes this a bit hard to return to. I love going back to Pound Cake, but I usually tune out by the time Paris Morton Music 2 starts, honestly. All in all, while my return to this album was a little more positive than my first listen, and I do understand why people see it as Drake's best, I can't say it enthralled me any more now than it did back in 2018. I appreciate Drake going for something a bit more rap influence and making a slightly harder turn, but a lot of the songs don't stick out as much as that of Drake's previous records. And this approach of going very rap heavy and avoiding making radio songs is something I think Drake has done a lot better, but we'll get to that in a minute. With this one, I can appreciate the level of polish that went into it, but I would say the high points here just aren't as consistent to me. It is refreshing to hear a more energetic, hungry Drake on this project, especially compared to some of his recent albums. And like I said about Take Care, I do think some of this record's lower points would probably be high points on more recent Drake albums. However, that's mostly because Drake himself sounds so bored and checked out on recent records to the point where putting this thing's low points on a modern Drake project would just be a moment of, whoa, where's this energy been? But here, the songs themselves don't bang quite as hard for me as they do for others. I gave it an okay back in 2018, and it might be unpopular, but I think I'd stand by that. It's decent and certainly better than a lot of projects that we're going to talk about, but it didn't have the impact that Take Care had for me. But next up, dear friends, we have one that is absolutely huge in my opinion, and a record that began a unique semantics trend, we'll say, for Drake. But yes, next up on our list, let's talk about the 2015 mixtape. If you're reading this, it's too late. We've got quite a bit of history to discuss because this was a massive shock when it first came out, especially with Drake going for a bit of a surprise release. Beforehand, we were hearing about Drake teasing his next album, Views from the Six, but rumors began to fly that he was going to release a mixtape first. While the material on this record would have more than qualified to be labeled as his fourth studio album, he instead went the route of classifying it as a mixtape. There are some big potential reasons why, as there seemed to be major drama behind this project both during and after its initial release. At the time, Lil Wayne was going through issues with Cash Money Records that were stopping him from releasing the Carter 5. This was a much publicized situation in the hip-hop world, one I'm sure you're all aware of, as that record was supposedly done in 2014 but not released until 2018, and it seemed Drake was picking his side fairly quickly. Initially, he wanted to release this as a free mixtape on Dat Piff, even having it be hosted by DJ Drama as like a classic Gangsta Girls mixtape. Cash Money intervened and this got a commercial release, but Drake may have supposedly wanted to use that to his advantage. Despite being classified as a mixtape, it would actually qualify as an album as part of his contract with Cash Money. Combine this with the fact that the project didn't quite have immediate radio singles, and there was rampant speculation at the time that Drake was using this record to show solidarity with Wayne Wayne and wean his way out of the contract with Young Money. Lil Wayne did even say that if he were to get out of Cash Money, he would take Drake and Nicki Minaj with him. Even after its release, it was engulfed in drama as Meek Mill dropped allegations that several songs on this record were actually ghostwritten by Quentin Miller. Diss tracks were released, defenses were made, Quentin himself acknowledged that he wasn't a ghostwriter. It was a wild time for Drake, but I gotta give this project a lot of credit. Ever since I reviewed this back in 2018, If You're Reading This has been by far my favorite project from Drake. I feel like it took what Nothing Was the Same was trying to do with the whole this shit ain't for radio approach and made it more concise and fleshed out with a more consistent and memorable track list to boot. And it's wild to say it, but going back to this record for this video, I find it to be even better now than I did in my initial listen. Right from the jump with the track Legend, we see Drake at his most confident throughout his project with some of his most effortful work yet. And with tracks like this, Know Yourself, and especially No Tellin', Drake shows a really strong ability to make a lot out of a little. On these tracks, the trap beats are a bit more minimal and, dare I say, even a bit ethereal sounding, but he makes them explode with these very confident, boastful, and charismatic performances. Same could be said for Energy and 10 Bands, which do have slightly bigger beats but nevertheless pop off even harder with Drake going ham on them. Perhaps this was the result of all the Cash Money beef, but it feels like Drake wanted to go as hard as he possibly could here, and it absolutely pays off, especially on the closer 6 p.m. in New York, which was apparently a bonus track. Pretty fantastic one if that's the case. It's a classic Drake freestyle where he even delivers a pretty scathing shot at Tyga, who was at the time dating a then 17-year-old Kylie Jenner, by telling him you need to act your age and not your girl's age. Say what you will about Drake's recent proximity to younger female celebrities like Millie Bobby Brown and Billie Eilish, but at the time, that bar must have hit like a freight train. As far as other super confident songs, Star 67 sees Drake slowing the flow just a little bit, but it works really well for him, especially in such a dark but low-key beat like this. Much like tracks like No Tellin', this is another song that benefits perfectly from a beat switch. A lot of the cuts here go for beat switches, and it's perfect because Drake is like a chameleon on these instrumentals. The hook on 6 Man still also lives in my head rent-free while Drake oozes energy and assurance, and the beat features some slick record scratches that are a compelling addition. I also have to say that 6 God grew on me compared to my original review. Back then, I just said that it wasn't a track I'd see myself looping, but in re-listening to this tape, dude, that Donkey Kong Country 2 Haunted Chase sample, insane. Amazing sample. And Drake absolutely going off on it with his flows and the integration of some singing, absolute banger. I also, no pun intended, used to not be into the track Used To with Lil Wayne. In my initial review, I couldn't really get behind the chorus, but honestly, I don't know what 2018 Matt was thinking. This is another wildly energetic banger with one of Drake's most charismatic vocal performances I've ever heard. I almost feel like modern Drake wouldn't try to put together a vocal performance like this again, and that's sad. If he came out and did something like this today, I'd probably jump out of my chair, or whatever reasonable facsimile I'd be seated in. For as many boisterous and confident songs as there are on this record though, Drake isn't afraid to go off into some more emotional directions, like with Now and Forever, the Wednesday Night interlude with Party Next Door, and especially Jungle. All of these songs still work amazingly, especially Jungle, which very well could be my all-time favorite Drake song. And it's because Drake, and Party Next Door in the case of Wednesday Night interlude, bring out some really great vocal performances to match the damn near heaven-sent instrumentals. These are honestly some of my most revisited Drake songs, which may be ironic given how different they are from the rest of this tape. Just goes to show how zeroed in Drake was on this project. And while it doesn't really have the same vocal vibe as these other songs, I think You and the Six is a massive highlight from Drake lyrically. Seeing him making a song addressing his mom, his relationship with his father, and his struggles with coping with fame. It's a really vulnerable track that I think shows just how good Drake can be on the writing front when he really hones in and focuses. Even the tracks I wasn't as crazy about on here would be highlights for Drake if he put them on modern projects. Madonna is a track where I still haven't really been able to get past the kind of sleepy vibe of the chorus, though I think Drake's energy on the verse is pretty solid, and the way the beat feels booming but still skeletal is pretty interesting. And while I love Party Next Door's vocals on Wednesday Night interlude, I can't say the same for his appearance on Preach. The filters on his vocals are pretty unflattering and take away from the vibe of the song for me, even though that electronic switch up and Sierra sample at the end are pretty damn amazing. Company with with Travis Scott was the track I previously listed as my least favorite on the mixtape, and I think that was more out of an if I really had to pick one kind of thing. Looking at it now, I don't know if I'd still call it my least favorite. Preach probably takes that now, but it's still not exactly a favorite of mine. Drake does his thing well, switching between rapping and singing, but the chorus still doesn't grab me, and some of Travis's auto-tune filters still feel a bit overwhelming for me. None of these really detract from my overall enjoyment of the mixtape though, and I could still at least enjoy them in pockets while they're on. Overall, it's kind of wild to me because, as I said earlier, this is my favorite project that Drake has put out, and that should come as no surprise because I've said this numerous times, but what I think is the wildest part is that I actually enjoyed it even more now than I did when I first listened to it. Quite a few tracks grew on me compared to my first listen, and it feels like this is the kind of record that could release today and feel right at home. It was easily Drake at his most hungry, while the production was among some of the most creative I've heard him on top of. I also find this to be potentially one of Drake's most cohesive records. This is a very specific thing, but you remember those black and white moments in the music video for Energy? For some weird reason, every time I hear a song from this record, I perfectly picture that music video. The vibe that he created with those black and white shots in the music video is something I could picture working for every track here, and I don't know about anyone else, but I don't think any album I've listened to, whether I've liked it better or worse than this, has achieved that level of cohesion. I hope I didn't confuse the hell out of anyone with that description, but yeah, that's how I feel. This was an excellent when I first reviewed it, and it still is today my favorite Drake project, and the kind of record I'm still convinced he won't top. Also, I figured major collab projects were worth talking about in this series, so let's jump into Drake's 2015 collaborative mixtape with Future, What a Time to Be Alive. Beyond Drake coming off of what I believed was his best project, this came at a huge commercial high point for Future with the then recent release of what many consider to be his best album, DS2. It was a very short project, especially given what's to come with Drake, and the diamond-studded cover sets the stage early and often that it's going to be a big, bold, braggadocious set of songs. That said, when I first did my review marathon of Drake's projects back in 2018, this was the one I enjoyed the least when walking away from all those records. Sadly, as much as people really enjoy Drake and Future together, I myself don't find them to be as exciting or harmonious as a duo, especially for a full project. And in my initial listen, I think I had felt like Drake did a lot of the heavy lifting, and to be honest, I still kind of feel that way going back to this record. As far as tracks that I really enjoyed from this thing, I do still find myself getting the chorus to Diamonds Dancing stuck in my head a few times. It's pretty damn catchy, and this is one of those songs where I think the vocal interplay between Drake and Future works out pretty well. They kind of go a bit singy here and there, and it works as the song goes in a couple different directions sonically, but lands well with each switch up. Change of Locations also works as a low-key banger with a spacey beat and some emotional vocal interplay between Future and Drake. I hadn't noticed this in my first listen, but Drake's chorus kind of reminds me of Furthest Thing from Nothing Was the Same, and I rock with it for that reason. I also really enjoy the 30 for 30 freestyle, which is anyone surprised that one of my favorite songs on here is the one that only has Drake on it? But it's a classic. Drake ends a project with a track that's just one long verse with no hook kind of thing. Though this is interesting thanks to the typically Heaven Sent 40 produced beat and a lot of Drake's lyrics, which continue to take aim at Meek Mill since this was released not long after their exchange of diss tracks. Sadly, while these songs are supremely enjoyable, they are the only tracks on this project that I find myself wanting to return to. Much of this tape feels very take it or leave it, though wildly enough a lot of that isn't Drake's fault. Digital Dash was initially one of my least favorite tracks when I first reviewed this tape, and while I don't think it's absolutely terrible, it's still a cut I could take or leave. The spendy trap beat feels a bit dime a dozen, and while Future takes most of the attention, I don't find myself engaging much with his performance. Big Ring still sounds a bit too close to Digital Dash for me, and I'm not too engaged with the chorus, though I can at least appreciate Drake's pretty boastful performance for giving the song a good deal of energy, and the beat feeling like something a bit Nothing Was the Same-esque. Live from the Gutter is a track I can appreciate a bit more now for its downbeat piano-led instrumental and Drake's kind of bouncy flow, but there's not much else that makes me want to come back, and it honestly kind of bores me a bit. I also had Scholarships among my least favorites in my initial review, and yeah, I still kind of feel that. While the beat wouldn't feel too out of place on a record like If You're Reading This, I still feel like Future kind of sleepwalks through the song and leaves Drake to lift it. I know Future's whole vibe is to be stoned out and all, but honestly, that works to the detriment of some songs. It just kind of bores me and makes me not want to listen to what he's saying. And while I like the ethereal vibes vibes and smooth singing from Drake on Plastic Bag. Man, I feel bad to keep saying it, but Future just doesn't hold my interest on this song. I almost start to wonder at this point what this tape would sound like if it was solo Drake. It's not like Future does a terrible job, but I just don't feel convinced by most of his performances here. And when we get to I'm the Plug, Future starts rapping off beat and I start checking out. It's sad because Drake comes in and starts rapid firing in what's a really convincing verse, but it's just not enough for me to want to return to the track. And then we get to Jumpman, which I notably ranked as one of my least favorite songs in my initial review of this project. I know that was a bit of a hot take at the time because of how iconic this song is to some. I feel like listening to it now, it's grown on me a little bit in that I wouldn't call it one of my least favorite tracks, but I still don't think I'd return to it all that much. Drake and Future do a decent job on here vocally, but the song itself still ends up a bit too repetitive to me. I'm not as against the Jumpman, Jumpman, Jumpman thing on the hook, but the overall flow of the track could have benefited from a bit of a switch up of some kind. Finally, while Drake delivered on his solo song to close out the project, Future's solo track Jersey didn't do as much for me. While the smooth vibey beat works pretty well, Future himself ends up being a bit too repetitive to click with me. There are some enjoyable pockets of the song here and there, but Future just doesn't really deliver all that much for me. Overall, I can't say my thoughts on this mixtape have changed all that much since reviewing it 4 years ago. I don't think it's agonizingly bad or anything like that, but I can't say it really stood out as anything that magical to me. I found out while re-listening to this tape that it was supposedly made in 6 days, and yeah, I can see that. In the context of this discussion of Drake though, I don't find him to be as at fault for this project's shortcomings. In fact, he's honestly the best part of it. The thing is, as I said earlier, I just don't think he and Future are like a goated combination that play to each other as often as they should on this project. In the case of this record, it sounds like Drake was running off of the hunger that he had on If You're Reading This, while Future was kind of dozing off and just cashing in on the DS2 success. Future as a performer, at least on this project, feels like the equivalent of a car that won't start. Everything seems right and you feel ready to drive, but once you hit that pedal, nothing happens. Ultimately, while he doesn't sound terrible or anything, his lack of effort compared to Drake does drag the project down a fair bit. Thus, it feels like a collaboration that Drake and Future only really made because they could. It wasn't a collab that needed to happen, it just happened. Maybe my lack of interest in it comes from the fact that I didn't listen to DS2, and from what I've heard, this tape is basically an extension of that album, but with Drake along for the ride. Even still, it does frighteningly little for me outside of those extremely scattered high points that I can continuously come back to. I gave this thing a bad rating when I first reviewed it, and yeah, I could stick to that. It's not agonizing, and trust me when I say that Drake has been involved with worse projects, but this is easily one of the weakest mainline records he's been involved in, even if its struggles are not entirely his fault. Now we've got Blurry. Now we've got the big fourth studio album 2016's Views. Yeah, he took out the From the Six part and just called it Views. Guess everyone was already running through the six with their woes, so he didn't need to put it in the title. Either way, this was released right when Drake was reaching that untouchable status. You saw how he handled the ghostwriting allegations. You could hit him with earth-shattering information that in some artists' cases could end their career, but for Drake, no one really cared. They just wanted to listen to the music. And coming off of a project like If You're Reading This made Views exciting even to some that weren't as into Drake's music. As the single started to roll in, we also saw a Drake that was taking an even deeper step outside of his comfort zone by experimenting with dancehall music, while even putting on a Jamaican patois at several points on the record. This even resulted in the single One Dance becoming Drake's first Billboard #1 single as a lead artist, though not all was right. After enjoying a strong critical streak, Views was the first Drake album that would receive a more lukewarm response. Between its long length, wait until the next records come out, and its material feeling like a bit of a retread. Even so, this was honestly a record I enjoyed at first listen. Certainly flawed, but there were a lot of tracks I enjoyed that I still come back to. And yeah, even after re-listening to the album, I still feel that way. Like, are some of the dancehall singles maybe a little corny today? Sure, you could say that. Tracks like One Dance, Too Good with Rihanna, and Controlla might feel a bit toothless, but honestly, this might just be my nostalgia trumping my practicality because I still rock with these tracks a lot. Controlla probably being my favorite of the bunch. Yes, it is weird hearing Drake say, "Cock up ya bumpa, sit down pon it," or talking about tings, but these are still easygoing, catchy, irresistibly danceable songs I can never resist while they're on. Hell, even though I didn't enjoy it at first, I still have to give a lot of credit to Hotline Bling for being such a fantastic single. It introduced the dancehall style that he'd really cling to for this album, but it also features one of his most memorable choruses and a very charismatic vocal performance as well. Even beyond these iconic singles, there are several non-singles that I still gravitate gravitate toward. On the more melodic front, I really enjoy tracks like Fire and Desire with Drake's nice crooning over the sped up chipmunk-esque sample of Brandy's I Dedicate, Feel No Ways with its Hold On We're Going Home vibes on the percussion, Keep the Family Close despite some of its corny lyrics like that one about the Chrysler that looked like the Bentley, or Redemption, which is one of those perfect Drake in my emotional bag moments that I return to rather often. From the more rap-oriented front, I do quite like the braggadocious nature of tracks like Hype and Still Here, the latter of which is another all-time favorite of mine that's gotten a boatload of replays. By the way, am I the only one that thought that section after the final hook of Still Here sounded like it was sampling that vine of the little girl yelling "Go!" at her dog and then face-planting? No, just me? Okay. Anyway, Weston Road Flows is another classic Drake freestyle that I absolutely love. The confident one long verse Drake song can often be really fun, especially when it's over a soulful R&B sample. And with this song grabbing Mary's joint by the legendary Mary J. Blige, we have ourselves a wonderful one, even if he has that ridiculous lyric about getting green like Earth Day. While there are a lot of great moments on this record, there are quite a few I don't care as much about, to put it nicely. 9 was a track I mostly only recognized for that Turn the 6 upside down, it's a 9 now lyric, and re-listening to it, I think a lot of my previous thoughts are about the same. The beat has a few colorful moments and Drake brings his A game on the performance, but the constant stops between sets of bars can honestly throw me off a little bit. It's a pretty good cut that honestly wouldn't have sounded out of place on If You're Reading This, but not one I'm going to be bumping as much as others on the album. Faithful is a track I've seen a lot of disdain toward, at least from Album of the Year, which is why it may be a bit of a surprise that it wasn't one of my least favorite songs on the album. That said, it's not a highlight, even if it's not a lowlight either. The posthumous Pimp C verse feels out of place with Drake's more melodic style, the chorus feels a bit too unstructured to grab me, and it's mostly lifted by the beautiful vocals of Division, who I'm still glad this song introduced me to. Child's Play actually managed to avoid my least favorites in my initial review, despite having one of my least favorite Drake bars ever. That corny-ass, goofy, whiny-ass line where he says, "Why you gotta fight with me at Cheesecake? You know I love to go there." I think it's because the instrumental is bouncy enough to work and gives the song a little charm even if the lyrics are kind of laughable. And the Summer's Over interlude naturally is a pretty nondescript one. It's handled by Majid Jordan and his vocals are certainly beautiful, but Wednesday Night interlude this ain't. It is a nice slow jammy kind of song though, and I feel like I would have loved it if it got turned into a full-length track either on a Drake project or a Majid Jordan album. I did have quite a few least favorites in my initial review, and most of them I pretty much stand by. You With Me is one of those low-key Drake songs where he's just kind of freestyling over a pretty minimal beat with a smaller performance. Not terrible, but there's not much life to it, and in its current form it feels like a bit of a throwaway. I think the disappointing part is that Drake's singing around the middle of the cut is great, and it could have been a highlight if he spent the whole song crooning. Sadly, he didn't, and it makes the song a little bit boring for me. With You with Party Next Door turned out to be another collaboration with these two that I really wanted to like more than I did. I do love their vocal interplay, but the bombastic electronic dance beat just doesn't grab me as much as the other melodic songs here, and it's a shame again because the vocal melodies are quite nice, but without much production to support them, it kind of falls flat to me. Grammys with Future also does shockingly little. I shouldn't need to repeat my feelings on Drake and Future as a duo, but while Drake sounds as confident as ever here and Future does decent too, his chorus is so shockingly repetitive that it kind of ruins the song. Pop Style, despite being one of the album's biggest singles, was also one of my least favorites from the album originally, and I honestly kind of stand by that. The beat is pretty amazing with a dark, spacey kind of pounding feel that I fucks with, but then Drake says, "Got so many chains they call me Chaining Tatum," and delivers a kind of boring slow flow, and suddenly I don't know what I just started. It's sad because it has good ideas, but it just does precious little for me. And the title track is interesting because this album closer, well, sort of, since Hotline Bling was a bonus track, was among my least favorites in 2018, but it sounds like a lot of the fan base really enjoys this one, as they tend to do with a lot of his album closers. At the time, I found the instrumental a bit too booming, not realizing that this is exactly the kind of thing Drake does often. With that in mind, I can appreciate the song a little bit more now than I did then, but it's still not one of my favorites. Compared to other hookless Drake freestyles, this one just feels a bit average, and given that there are already 1 or 2 tracks like this on the album, it doesn't hit as hard for me as similar cuts do, even if it closes the album decently enough. All in all, my thoughts on Views remain the same as they did back in 2018, in that I find it a bit inconsistent, but nevertheless pretty good. Yes, Drake was a bit all over the place on this project, project, and that can apply to some of the sequencing on the album too, but there are more than enough highlights that I can continue to bump in spite of the lowlights. I feel like part of this record's disappointment can be the result of it directly following an album like If You're Reading This, which is often seen as one of his bests, so this felt like a bit of a step backward. Nowadays, I feel like it occupies such an interesting space in Drake's discography in that it's disappointing compared to a lot of what came before it, but amazing compared to what came after. While many will kind of look at this as the beginning of his end as far as being a consistently strong artist, I kind of see it as a bit of an underrated piece in his catalog. Not to say it's a classic, but it's certainly quite enjoyable. I gave it a good in my original review, and I'd probably stick to that. The high points make me want to lean ever so lightly into the great tier, but I think I'll stick to a good because of those low points. Otherwise, this was an enjoyable and perhaps even misunderstood album in Drake's lineup. But we've got more semantics coming at you because it's time for Drake's 2017 playlist, More Life. This is where that semantics battle continues, like I said. While there is more than enough material to be labeled as an album or a mixtape, he instead chose to have it marketed as a playlist. Why? I don't know. He said he wanted to make something that would become the soundtrack to your life, which, I mean, a few songs, sure, but this is a lot for a soundtrack to my life. Hell, it's a little longer than Views. How does that work? Either way, he released this to just bridge the gaps between major projects while still getting to treat it as a major project. I don't get how it works either. Interestingly, this was actually the first Drake record I reviewed back in 2017, and by proxy, the first Drake record I listened to fully. As I often mention, I wasn't really listening to albums that much before I reviewed them in 2017, so this was the first one that I got to listen to in its entirety. At the time, I found it to be just okay, but I do have to give it credit for how many of its songs have become part of my regular rotation. Like, honestly, there are a lot of melodic songs on here that I think are among some of my most revisited Drake songs. Yes, singles like Passion Fruit and Fake Love are great integrations of some of the dancehall styles of Views, but there's also the beautifully mellow Teenage Fever with its Jennifer Lopez sample, the part rap, part sung personal ode that is Lose You, and a pair of collaborations that I've returned to often. We have the confident Glow featuring Kanye West at a time where these two were seemingly not at odds with each other, and the fantastic Since Way Back with Party Next Door, which is one of the most get me in my feels Drake songs that also features one of my favorite beat switches from him. Like, holy hell, that second half is incredible. And there are a few harder songs that do bang a bit here, like the Skepta interlude that's pretty awesome. He goes pretty hard over a beat that samples the Victory Road theme from Pokemon Gold. And as controversial as it was at release, I do really enjoy KMT with Gigs. This song was bashed a lot because of Drake supposedly ripping XXXTentacion's Look at Me flow on it, but honestly, I like this a bit better, a bit less abrasive on the ears. But while those are nice songs, there are also a lot of moments I could honestly forget about from here that make this one of Drake's weaker records. Free Smoke is a nice little banger, but the repetitiousness of the flow and the averageness of the hook do hold it back for me. No Long Talk with Gigs is one of several moments on this playlist where Drake's frequent use of his Jamaican patois makes the song come across a bit more silly than anything. While Drake's interludes can often hit hard, the Georgia interlude with, of course, Georgia Smith was nice enough but didn't include enough of her to leave an impression for me, though I did like that Doing It Wrong sample. Madiba Redim had some fun energy but still kind of sounds like a Discount One dance, and Blem is a Caribbean influence track that sounds even clunkier now than I remember, with Drake seemingly unable to decide if he wants to purposely sing off beat or stay within the song. 4422 solely features Sampha, and it's got a pertinent amount of sadness to it, even though it's not one of Sampha's best, and I still feel like it doesn't really belong on the playlist. Nothing's Into Something wastes a mellow beat and some light vocals with a lackluster chorus and a lack of really anything, especially in contrast to Teenage Fever, which follows it and is pretty similar but feels a bit more substantial. Can't Have Everything is a more banging song that I did enjoy a little bit more than I did before, but with a lack of a hook and a second verse that's very intentionally offbeat. I can't say it's my favorite song from Drake in this style. I do have to give it some credit because it kind of feels like Jimmy Cooks a few years in advance, and that song felt like it inspired at least a bit of the direction he and 21 Savage would go in with Her Loss, so there's that. Even the album's typical one-verse, no-hook, tell-all, do not disturb doesn't do as much for me. The sampled Snow Allegra time vocals are great over the beat, but the actual song does very little that Drake's many other freestyles in this style haven't already done for me. As far as the songs I felt were lowlights back in the day, Get It Together still grates me a bit with its overbearing electronic-led beat, Drake sounding kinda bored, and the song lacking much of a hook despite solid vocals from Georgia Smith. Galchester once again bores me, with Drake not really bringing much excitement with his short start-stop flows and lack of many other exciting factors in the vocals or production. Portland, despite being a pretty big single, still kinda bores me. Drake sounds good on it, but Quavo and Travis Scott don't grab me as much, and the flute in the background doesn't do all that much for me. Although that line where Drake says he could never have a kid and still be out here kidding around is another one of those poorly aged things moments for him, so that gave me a chuckle when I heard it. Sacrifices struggles despite having a solid emotional piano intro, as the beat it transitions into is pretty whatever, and the performances of Drake, 2 Chainz, and Young Thug all feel like they could use more energy. Though once again, shout out to that "Got No Baby on the Way" lyric that aged like milk. And Young Thug's chorus on Ice Melt sounds even weirder than I remember, and it doesn't exactly sound distinct compared to a lot of what else is on the record. It's kinda on brand with a lot of this playlist. A lot of it doesn't really sound that interesting. Overall, I wondered if my thoughts would change on this project given that back in 2017 it was the first Drake record I'd ever heard fully, but the context of Drake's other projects didn't really add or subtract much from this record. Honestly, the classification of this as a playlist still feels like an exercise in gimmicky marketing, but it made me realize something else. And it's that it really does feel like a playlist, but I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment. The record feels like a playlist insofar as there isn't really much cohesion to it. Not much thought has really been put into the sequencing of this, which means it doesn't really flow all that much. Outside of maybe 1 or 2 examples where one song leads nicely into the next, the record just feels a bit all over the place and the overall quality isn't always top notch. A strong second half slightly makes up for a weak first half, but otherwise, yeah, this is kinda meh. I gave it an okay back in the day and I still stand by that rating today. It's not horrible, but outside of some choice cuts, it feels a bit inessential in Drake's catalog, almost like a Views B-Sides victory lap type thing at best. Up next, this is one I'm gonna say a lot about, but let's get into his 5th studio album, 2018's Scorpion. You'll hear me say this a lot, and you can apply these words to a lot of the projects here, but this was a huge album when it released in 2018. Not only was Drake fully at the untouchable tier with his Scary Hours EP and singles like God's Plan and Nice for What spending several weeks at #1 on Billboard, but he had a lot riding on this record. Coming into its release, he had just been embroiled in a major beef with Pusha T that culminated in Pusha dropping the scintillating, absolutely disrespectful diss track The Story of Adidon, where he said a lot about Drake's family, his producer 40, his black identity, but also revealed to the world that Drake was hiding a child that he had with an artist and former adult film star, Sophie Brousseau. With such a vicious track, questions turned to how Drake would respond to such a thing. And quite frankly, a few fans didn't seem too impressed with the response given the record's relative disdain among some listeners, but don't tell that to the charts. In the record's first week, 7 of its singles hit the top 10 on Billboard, which is already nuts, but wait till you see what's coming next. When I reviewed this record back in 2018, I actually really enjoyed it, way more than most others did, and it's because of this that despite the daunting 25-track set list, I was kind of looking forward to returning to this album. I really wanted to see if this was a record I still rocked with heavily, or if the hype had gotten to me. And oddly enough, I still enjoy this as much as I did in 2018. How about it? Notably, despite its massive length, Drake decided to split this album into 2 parts. Side A and Side B. The first part is the rap side, while the latter settles into the pop and R&B lane. Honestly, I get the impression that this was inevitable. After a series of more hip-hop oriented projects with Nothing Was the Same, If You're Reading This It's Too Late, and What a Time to Be Alive, Drake tried to mix his 2 styles on Views and More Life, but these records had some issues when it came to cohesion. As a result, dividing the album into a pair of sides might mitigate that a bit. With that said, I get the impression that this hurt the album a bit for some. While Side A was generally well received outside of a dud or 2, Side B was the point where things waned a bit for quite a few, with a few really really good tracks and some pretty laughable ones. Side A did feature one of Drake's biggest singles in God's Plan, a track added from his first Scary Hours EP that I do still very much enjoy. Even if it's a bit basic by Drake standards, the beat hits pretty hard and the multiple hooks are super catchy. As far as basicness though, it doesn't get much worse than I'm Upset, which is by far one of Drake's worst pre-album singles ever and worst singles in general ever. Beyond Drake's incessant whining on the track, I'd complain about the flow if there was even a flow to complain about. It hardly even goes off. The flow is so basic, one note, and rudimentary, especially from someone like Drake, to the point where I think the clout-chasing kid who made diss tracks about me in high school could have come up with a flow more compelling. Now, this inconsistency didn't actually carry too heavily into the whole of Side A, as this side features some really enjoyable Drake rap bangers that I've come back to quite a bit, like Nonstop, Mob Ties, and Can't Take a Joke. They might not be among Drake's hardest hitting hip-hop oriented tracks, but they're still very enjoyable as a whole. In re-listening, I do at least see how some tracks can be a bit boring to some, even if I enjoy them quite a bit, like the intro track Survival with its slow feel, but I think the electronic beat combined with Drake's conflicted tone that feels both emotional and confident at the same time is pretty interesting, and hey, at least he didn't take forever on the intro like he did before. Emotionless also grabs me a lot with Drake's vulnerable lyrics and that incredible Mariah Carey emotion sample that I'm a sucker for, while 8 out of 10 honestly feels like an old school Drake song with a boastful, soul-filled instrumental and Drake's emphatic vocal performance that shows the level of hunger he can have when he actually tries. And the closer to Side A, Is There More is another one I really enjoy in spite of its clear flaws. Yes, some of Drake's shots at Pusha T feel more like pokes, and some of the overall writing is a bit awkward, but I enjoy the spacey, ethereal production and the way Drake's flow floats along on it rather smoothly. It's one of the many moments on the record where I understand why others don't like it, but for some strange, unexplainable reason that may or may not be tied to nostalgia, I do. Now, not every song on Side A hits for me. I already mentioned I'm Upset, but Elevate still feels a bit too insubstantial for me and could have used maybe another verse or a better hook, even though the sing-rapping sounds rather nice, I'll say. And Sandra's Rose, though it has a very nice message addressing his mother as something of a tribute, does feel a bit standard up against so many similar kinds of songs that Drake has done in this style, even though it does have a nice soulful beat with a beautiful sample. And it also does have some weird bars here and there, though I will say I like it a tiny bit better now than I did before. Talk Up was surprisingly one of my least favorites on the album before, and it's still a bit of a non-starter for me. The lack of a compelling hook plus Jay-Z outshining Drake in a big way took it down a peg for me. As for Side B, we did get one of Drake's best singles in my opinion with Nice for What. This was his admittedly very quick jump into New Orleans bounce that I can't believe didn't last much longer, but it's a jump I quite like. The instrumental is powerful, Drake's vocal performance is incredibly charismatic, and he really fits over the sound extremely well, which is why I'm surprised he didn't go for it a bit more. I mean, yeah, we did get In My Feelings, which is also a song I enjoy for similar reasons as Nice for What, though not quite as much, but you'd have thought he'd go for this a lot more. Or if not him, other artists would have jumped on the New Orleans bounce sound in the same way they all jumped on dancehall and Afrobeat after Views came out. But I digress. These were two of Drake's bigger recent singles, though I feel like Nice for What tends to go a little bit underrated, and they're still huge favorites of mine. Even more so than Side A, though, Side B is the part of Scorpion where I 100% see why people didn't like it as much, even though I kinda do for some reason. Like, I totally see how a track as slow and potentially cheesy as Peak may threaten to bore some to death, but I think the slowed down spacey feel and auto-tuned Drake vocals bring me back to songs that I liked off of Thank Me Later, and the melodies are honestly really catchy to me. Similar thing with Jaded. I see how it could be seen as filler given that Drake spends a lot of the song just vocally riffing, but I do enjoy going back to it as the low-key energy of the beat with Drake's smooth vocals and nice background vocals from Ty Dolla $ign remind me of some tracks I like off of Care Package or one of the rare R&B cuts off of If You're Reading This. I know that's a bit of a bold comparison, but yeah, that's how I feel about this track. That's How You Feel has a bit more of a trap instrumental that might make it seem a little bit weird on Side B, but I think Drake's low-key performance has some good charisma to it, while the sample of Nicki Minaj's remix of Boss Ass Bitch is honestly kinda charming. Then Blue Tint comes along and actually manages to grab me with its pretty fun hook and Drake's fun sing-rapping over the bouncy hip-hop influenced beat. I know what I I said, and yeah, even though side B is considered the R&B side, I'd probably more appropriately title it the songs about girls side. Also, Future has an uncredited chorus that has some goofy charm to it. And as another example of a song a lot of people may not like, but I kinda do, Don't Matter to Me features a posthumous guest hook from the king of pop himself, Michael Jackson, which naturally is gonna gather some side eyes because you're using vocals from an artist who can't approve them, and perhaps the most legendary pop artist at that. Many also took issue with the mixing of his vocals to where it almost sounded like The Weeknd, thus he probably should have just tried to get Abel even though they might have been beefing at the time. And yeah, I do now hear it and kinda imagine that this is probably what an AI-generated Michael Jackson would sound like, but honestly I like the ghostly sound of the vocals and the catchiness of that hook is nice, while Drake does a good job with the snappy production. After Dark features a posthumous appearance from Static Major along with a non-posthumous appearance from Ty Dolla $ign. This has always been a huge favorite of mine from this album, as I love the classic R&B feel of the song that throws back nicely to the 90s and 2000s R&B that was popular when Static Major was alive. Drake and Ty Dolla $ign are built for this kind of sound and they absolutely dominate it, and whilst the integration of Static Major is very slight, I think this is a respectful tribute to him in the style of music he was making during his life, one that was cut short far sooner than it should have been. And then the all-important closer March 14th comes along, the track where Drake reveals to the world that Adonis is indeed his child. I think this is a fitting closer and I love how mellow the production feels, while Drake's rapping kind of fits in with the nervous nature of becoming a father and wanting to be there for his son when his dad wasn't there for him. I also think his singing on the outro is particularly poignant, Drake realizing his lonesomeness and realizing that the boy has to try to become a man. Whether that happened with his music, your mileage may vary, but it's still a really well-crafted song that I quite like. Now yes, there are tracks on side B that I'm genuinely not into, and I can't really defend them as much as I did previous ones. Take Summer Games, for example. While this is a fair bit faster pace on the instrumental side of things, Drake doesn't really do a whole lot with it, nor does he craft a catchy enough hook, which makes it feel like a bit of a non-starter, even though it has those trademark emotional vibes that Drake is known for. Finesse was also a track I put among my least favorites on the album, largely just for how much of a nothing song it is. Almost no hook and very little that can be reasonably called substance makes this a pretty forgettable track as a whole. But as for tracks that are memorable despite not being so great, Ratchet Happy Birthday, everyone. This song managed to dodge my worst tracks originally and still probably does, largely because the beat is colorful and because the song does have some goofy charm to it. Like those weird jumps into his falsetto, that part where he goes, "It's a brrrr." I can't roll my tongue, don't judge me. The "I know you're soft like buttercups, Reese's don't be ridiculous" lyric being so corny. It's honestly kind of funny and it makes this a little bit charming despite not actually being all that good. And Final Fantasy, for as many jokes as I can make about it not paying homage to the video game series whatsoever, is another non-starter for me. The first half sees Drake doing the whole emotionless thing over a light electronic beat, and the song is left to be saved by the spacey, incredibly lovely second half where Drake's vocals and the downbeat production are enough to send me into my feels. Sadly, that's the best the song can do, and it's kind of a shame. But man, what a curious album. I feel like I spent a lot of time on this record compared to some of the others, but that's because it's so fascinating to me. An album that I could definitely understand the flaws of and totally see why others view it as the beginning of the end for Drake, yet it's one of my favorite projects from him. Oddly enough, it just so happens that I enjoyed a vast majority of this thing, but I think it's a pretty focused record that still sees Drake giving enough effort to make the hip-hop and R&B side of things a compelling listen. If you're a fan of Drake, that is, which I'd obviously say I am. Don't get it twisted. I totally understand the negative reception to it. In fact, this record definitely has some franchise original sin going on with it, where I feel like some of Drake's bad habits that soiled his CLB and onward output can be traced back here, and it may not be as easy to jump into now without the context of everything going on in Drake's life in 2018. And the album is certainly bloated, but I found myself vibing with a really good amount of it. Sure, this may be a case of enjoying the album in spite of itself, or who knows, maybe this seems better to me in hindsight given Drake's recent struggles with new projects. I boldly gave it an excellent back in 2018, and I will remain bold and keep it at that. Is it fair to call it a flawed masterpiece? Well, I don't know about masterpiece, but something along those lines certainly works. I'm still just as surprised as you probably are, but hey, I could still enjoy a lot of these tracks after all these years. Can't put a price on that. Oh yeah, and I mentioned it earlier and thought I'd throw it in, but sure, I'll talk about the 2019 compilation album, Care Package. Not long after reissuing So Far Gone on streaming services, Drake took to packaging together a bunch of loose singles that were scattered across YouTube and SoundCloud, and just properly released them on streaming services to give fans something to listen to while they waited for the next album. More notably, this was Drake's first major release outside of his The Best in the World Pack EP, not to be distributed by Cash Money Records. While he remained on the label even after the initial Wayne drama, it seems his contract lasted a bit longer than that. On the track Is There More from Scorpion, Drake rapped the bar, "Soon as this album drop, I'm out of the deal," indicating that he would no longer be tied down to Cash Money. As a result, all remaining projects we talk about will just be distributed under his own label OVO, whose artists operate under Warner Records, outside of Drake, whose records are still distributed through Republic. Now, when I listened to this back in 2019, I was honestly kind of impressed by a lot of the songs here, and a lot of them would even join my regular rotation. Even listening to it now, it's still one of the most enjoyable Drake projects to return to, even with its warts. When it comes to the songs that have been in my regular rotation the most, a lot of the more spacey R&B vibes have been in the heaviest rotation for me. Tracks like Trust Issues, which was his softer flip of the DJ Khaled collab I'm On one, and especially I Get Lonely, which I swear in some circles was called I Get Lonely too. His cover of TLC's Fan Mail that delivers those strong emotional Drake vibes that I feel like he just can't hit the same when he tries to do them today. More on that later. I also really enjoy The Motion with Sampha with its deep bass integration, Drake's charismatic performance and vocals, and the lovely background vocals from Sampha. Hearing this again as a track released in the lead up to Nothing Was the Same, I do honestly see this fitting nicely on that project. Days in the East kinda mixes that charismatic, energetic rapping with low-key, lovely vocals on a super spacey beat that definitely would have felt fitting if it was included on If You're Reading This It's Too Late. It was released between that project and Nothing Was the Same. And the closer, Can I, has a low-key feel and a charismatic performance from Drake along with a uniquely implemented Beyonce feature. Even though she just kinda repeats some of the same lines over and over, it still works well for the dark vibe. As far as the more confident tracks here, there are some bangers too. Dreams Money Can Buy is a classic moment of Drake rapping confidently over a spacey, at times almost haunting beat with a prominent Jai Paul sample of the song BTSTU. That Don't Fuck With Me vocal on the hook is pretty damn awesome. This is also a pretty noteworthy song as it felt like this was one of the first times Drake tried to throw some chin checks at Pusha T, who would even respond over the same beat on a song titled Don't Fuck With Me, and he even used the words "Dreams Money Can Buy" on the chorus. This whole beef started over clothes. What, you don't believe me? Look it up. It's true. And Draft Day is a banger and a really interesting one. A dedication to Drake's friend and NFL bust Johnny Manziel with a fantastic sample of Do Up That Thing by Lauryn Hill, where he also name drops Chance the Rapper. This sounds like a fever dream, and yet the song is damn good and really memorable. He even left a bit of instrumental at the end for everyone to rap over. Very generous of him. I've also gotten a lot of mileage out of How About Now, a low-key banger that hits extremely hard to the point where I'm a tiny bit surprised that it didn't make the cut on the standard edition of If You're Reading This It's Too Late. There's also Paris Morton music, his extended chorus and verse from Rick Ross's fantastic Aston Martin music that mixes his singing and rapping pretty nicely. I'd even argue I like the extended hook even more than the original. And then of course the big ones, 5 a.m. in Toronto and 4 p.m. in Calabasas. Two major entries in Drake's AM/PM series, and while 5 a.m. wasn't the first entry, 9 a.m. in Dallas was, it was an incredibly important one. The moment where the AM/PM series turned into a subliminal shot-firing fest. With 5 a.m. we have shots at Chris Brown, Common, Pusha T, and allegedly The Weeknd, but honestly probably not. And on 4 p.m. we have Joe Budden and Diddy as the targets. Wanna know something funny? My autocorrect changed Joe Budden to Joe Sudden. There's a joke in there somewhere. Interesting how there are two different styles to the songs here. 5 a.m. features Drake at his most brash, attitude-driven, and confident, maybe with one of his best verses overall, while on 4 p.m. he goes for a slightly emotionless style, which at times feels intentional for the shots he fires at Diddy. But both are great entries in a series of tracks that consistently rank among Drake's best. It always feels like the AM/PM series sees Drake in his top form. But of course, in spite of all of these highlights, there are points I'm not as crazy about, as between the strong 9-track run at the start and 2 good final tracks, there's a middle stretch that's less interesting to me. Jodeci Freestyle is certainly not bad, and I think Drake and J. Cole do well enough with the glamorous beat, but there's not too much about it that really grabs me other than the way this re-release handles its controversial lyric. On the original song, J. Cole had a bar making light of individuals with autism and even used the ableist R slur, which was controversial enough that both artists had to apologize. Now, because nothing on this project was re-recorded, the lyric was simply removed from the song, which, while good news, sounds awkward when you hear it back, because it's just a piece of empty space in the middle of a verse. Pretty awkward for a compilation of what Drake describes as some of his most important moments. Unless he's referring to the learning experience as the important moment, which it should be. Club Paradise is a bit better than it was in my first listen, largely because I enjoy Drake's vocals on the hook a bit more, but the verses still don't feel that exciting to me. That piano instrumental is nice though, and as a prep single for Take Care, I could see how this would have fit on the album. Girls Love Beyonce has a few interesting interpolations of Say My Name by Destiny's Child, largely thanks to James Fauntleroy, but its standardness becomes a bit compounded when you place it as track 15 on a 17-track compilation. You start feeling like it's meshing together with everything else, and it takes you out pretty quickly. And as far as the lowest of the low, My Side was a bonus track for If You're Reading This It's Too Late, and I'm glad it was left to only the physical edition of the tape. While Drake's vocals are as charismatic as anything else on that project, this is an almost agonizingly slow song that I'd honestly put among one of Drake's most boring tracks. It just pales heavily in comparison to the other If You're Reading This bonus track, How About Now. Free Spirit does see some faster flows out of Drake, but there is not much else that stands out about it other than the sort of squicky feeling I get when I hear Rick Ross talking about a girl masturbating in his Porsche. And Heat of the Moment has some nice vocal moments here and there, but a combination of occasionally laughable lyrics and that bubble popping sound on the instrumental just distract me way too much to take this song seriously. All in all though, these are some damn good tracks. I do think there could have been a little more sequencing to put these together a bit better, something that could have also prevented that weak middle stretch I was talking about, but this record still hits for me. A lot of the songs here have entered my regular rotation, and I think the high points happen to be some really fantastic Drake cuts. That's something you might not really expect out of a collection of Lucy's B-sides and bonus tracks, but I think it helps that a lot of these came from a time in Drake's career where he was a lot hungrier and more passionate, which makes the quality a lot better. It doesn't sound like Drake is just phoning some shit in or anything like that. It feels like moments where Drake still felt like he had something to prove. And for the most part, whether we're talking about the confident jams or the R&B stuff, a lot of this still hits. I gave it a good rating in my initial review before great was a part of my scale, and looking back at it now, I think I'd up the rating to a great. Still a release I'm very impressed with, and even for its warts, it features some big-time Drake favorites of mine. I feel weird saying this is another one of my favorite Drake projects, but yeah, here we are. I obviously have a lot of weird and unpopular Drake opinions, so welcome to Bizarro World. We've got one more holdover project to talk about, and it's Drake's 2020 mixtape, Dark Lane Demo Tapes. With his 6th studio album taking way longer than a lot of us reasonably expected, Drake decided to drop one more project before it as a sort of warm-up, if you will. This was similar to Care Package, though, in that it was a compilation of loose tracks that had been floating around on the internet through outlets like SoundCloud, though the material here was definitely a bit newer. This was also right as the COVID-19 pandemic was kicking in and there was some potential uncertainty as to how many artists would navigate it. So it seems Drake just wanted to give fans a body of work to enjoy instead of just putting out spare singles. I reviewed this back when it came out and honestly found it to be a pretty good listen, but with that said, I haven't returned to it a ton since then, which made me a little curious about how I'd feel about it now. We're gonna keep this section short because it's not nearly as big as some of Drake's other projects, but I do still enjoy this a bit even if it's not close to being one of his best records. Of all the songs here, the one I've returned to the most is the Chicago Freestyle, largely for its downbeat feel and especially that incredible Giveon hook. That's not to discredit Drake though, I do think that flip of Eminem's Superman on the back end of his verses was pretty damn cool. And while I haven't returned to all of these tracks as much as something like Chicago Freestyle, I do like the hazy instrumentation and smooth rapping of Deep Pockets, the soulful sample and focus flows on When to Say When, the spaced out old school R&B Drake vibe vibes of Not You Too with a subtle but nicely integrated Chris Brown feature. The somewhat bouncier and moodier Time Flies, which has one of the record's most memorable hooks in my opinion. The darker, more emphatic banger Landed, and the surprising turns into drill music with Demons in War, which I admittedly got a bit more out of than some others in spite of their cheesiness. Drake's British accent, anyone? And hell, I was actually one of the 7 people that liked Tootsie Slide when I first reviewed the project. And honestly, in a weird way, I still kind of do. Is it a cheesy, lazy attempt at getting some TikTok clout? Yeah, you bet. And hell, not that every TikTok dance is a think tank, but the dance itself is one of the most basic things ever conceived. But I can't pretend I don't find the song a tad catchy. In some bizarro way, there's something kinda airy and fun about it that makes it easy for me to re-listen to. It's definitely far from Drake's best, but I do enjoy it, and I've definitely heard lazier out of Drake. When it comes to the less memorable tracks though, Desires has a bit of a clunky hook to me, even if Drake's vocals on it are solid. And I once again find that Future doesn't really add much to what already feels like another standard song. Losses feels a lot more standard than similar Drake songs in the style, with a light beat and a background vocal sample that honestly just feels repetitive and doesn't really stand out to me. And while D4L is one of the more liked songs on the project for understandable reasons given its sheer energy, it's another track I think is just fine. It might still be the repetitive what's Hannanin that's kind of throwing me off. I don't think it's bad at all, it's just a track I could see myself taking or leaving. And as far as the lowest of the low, I think Pain 1993 is a track I'd like a lot more if not for Playboi Carti's guest verse. Granted, it's not like I don't think Drake doesn't sound a little awkward here, but he definitely does a better job than Carti, whose baby voice does precious little for a song like this. Even after letting Whole Lotta Red grow on me a bit, this verse still absolutely throws everything off for me and kinda grates my ears. Meanwhile, From Florida with Love still feels like a total sonic snoozer that wastes some interesting writing on a pretty damn sparse beat that feels like it's sleepwalking, trying desperately to convince you it's awake when it's not. All in all though, I do still think this is a pretty fine project. There's enough enjoyable stuff here that makes it work, even though I think my enjoyment of some of the unpopular songs may make this something I enjoy in spite of itself. I already know there's going to be a lot of unpopularity over this getting a higher rating from me than, say, Nothing Was the Same, but I think expectations might have helped this out a little bit for me. Being that it's basically a demo project, I think it's a little easier for me to meet it in the middle in some moments. Plus, I still think it sounds like it has some genuine effort out of Drake, which is saying a lot for a collection of basically loose, previously unreleased tracks. It's obviously not his finest hour, but for what it is, there's enjoyment to be had with it. In my original review, I gave it a good rating, and I think I could comfortably stick with that. Nothing too crazy, but it's solid enough, and it's an enjoyable, if rather inessential, listen. But now, we enter the Dark Age. The point that even I, as a Drake fan, have trouble defending. The beginning of the lazy, horny Drake trilogy. First, let's talk about that 6th studio album, 2021's Certified Lover Boy. This came 3 years after Scorpion, which was the longest drought between studio albums in Drake's catalog. Naturally, hype was going to build from that, especially with a series of delays that saw this miss its summer 2020 release and not come until very late in the summer of 2021. It was early September, so the record was getting ready for the fall more than anything. At least he gave us Scary Hours 2 in the meantime. That was good, I enjoyed that. And what a star-studded release. Not like Drake is a stranger to features, but he got damn near everyone and their mother to show up on this project, including Kid Cudi, who he had a notorious beef with in 2016. Nice that that was able to come to an end. While by far his most feature-filled album, I was a bit concerned that the sheer amount of collabs would make Drake a little less important on his own project, and when the cover was shown off, what the fuck is this? Another beginning of a terrible trend for Drake where he intentionally makes his album covers bad. And when I listened to the album, okay, I didn't hate it, but I was very disappointed in the project as a whole. And even though it hit a new commercial high for Drake with 9 songs hitting the Billboard Top 10 in its first week, much of what was on here didn't hit for me even if it reached the top 10. He should have done what he did with Views and Scorpion and thrown Laugh Now, Cry Later in the track list. That's a genuinely great song. Instead, we got a pretty long set of cuts that at times can be very good, but at other times can be very disappointing. Though maybe I am feeling a tiny bit nicer nicer toward this album now because Drake has dropped worse since. Admittedly, there were quite a few highlights in my original review, and while part of that is by way of this having so many tracks on it that a few of them managed to stick when they were thrown at the wall, I did genuinely like some songs here. There's the classic Bare My Soul opening and closing bookends and Champagne Poetry and The Remorse, respectively. The rare energetic bangers like Poppy's Home and Fair Trade with Travis Scott. The song Love All with its more low-key sing-rapping from Drake and solid guest verse from Jay-Z. The emotional interlude that is Yebba's Heartbreak, where Yebba's vocals over the light piano just hit in all the right ways. The genuinely hungry and subliminal-filled cuts No Friends in the Industry, 7 AM on Brittle Path, and especially You Only Die Twice with Rick Ross and Lil Wayne. A dark, sinister, and venomous track in Knife Talk with 21 Savage and Project Pat. And the rare emotional jams that managed to work in Race My Mind and I Am Y2 with Kid Cudi. It was a surprise to me when I came back to this record and actually still enjoyed several of these high points. I thought I was being nice to it in my original review, and maybe I was and still am, but I actually genuinely like quite a few of the songs on this album. But there is certainly some mid on this project, and a lot that teeters on going lower than mid. Girls Want Girls, for example, actually has some decent vocal moments along with a good Lil Baby verse, but it's another bland one that I'd have completely forgotten about if not for Drake's sudden admission that he's a lesbian. That shit I was hearing in elementary school, and Drake was in his early 30s with a whole-ass kid talking nonsense like that on this track. What a world. Meanwhile, TSU narrowly avoided my worst tracks in my initial review, but that doesn't mean it's very good. It's still a snoozer with corny lyrics that ultimately fail to live up to the many songs that Drake has done 20 times better in this style, especially given that it's 5 minutes where the first minute is just chopped and screwed talking from OG Ron C. In Too Deep actually starts pretty great with the guitar integration and Drake's sing-rapping flows, but it crashes and burns in the second half, trading that sound for a generic trap sound, repetitive chorus, and another bland future verse. Pipe Down tries to be a bit more R&B influence with sing-rapping, but while Drake's vocals are nice enough, the song doesn't do much to stand out. Also, true to the song's title, I was telling the instrumental to pipe down a bit because it felt like it was mixed a little too loud over Drake's vocals, to the point where I couldn't really enjoy them much. On a lot of Drake's best ballads, his vocals are the most prominent thing on the song, but here they just fade to the back a little, and that's upsetting. It's not overly bad, just disappointing. And trust me when I say there are some absolute stinkers in the track list. In the Bible, for example, features what may be one of the worst choruses I've ever heard out of Drake. What with that goofy, okay, that I guess is meant to make you think he's gonna come through with some heat, only to rip the loudest, wettest fart in the quietest location possible. Doesn't help that the rest of the song sounds like it's running on autopilot while Drake is half asleep with his hand down his pants. Well, at least Giveon and Lil Durk do their thing on the song. The bad news also includes the album's big single, Way Too Sexy, a Future and Young Thug collab that I feel can at best be described as so bad it's good, but that's only on a good day, and by good day I mean a day where the song is playing on mute. Seriously, that hook goes on way too damn long, holy shit, and literally everyone sounds like they're hardly trying. And what is with artists still trying to sample I'm Too Sexy by Right Said Fred? If Taylor Swift couldn't get it to work, how were these guys going to get it to work? Peace, Matt. Peace. Save it for the next album. Okay, anyway. Fountains wastes a Thames appearance on a largely flavorless Afrobeat instrumental that I feel like would be enough to make some people appreciate Drake's previous attempts at dancehall and Afrobeat, to the point where they might even seem like career highlights. It's a shame because Thames does a good job, but otherwise the song is utterly boring. And speaking of wasting features, Get Along Better has Ty Dolla $ign on the song, but you'd hardly notice it because he only really appears in the background until like the last 30 seconds, if that. Much of the song feels like boring background filler, but it probably could have been at least a little bit better if Ty Dolla $ign was given a larger role. I mean, this instrumental feels like it was practically made for him. How is he only in the background? and fucking fans near the end of the album feels like boredom incarnate. The beat is way too unassuming, and Drake's vocals don't really hit on the song enough to make this feel like anything other than a snoozer. So overall, CLB remains a very disappointing album, but honestly, Way Too Sexy rant aside, I feel like I don't actively hate it like some others do. Actually, in revisiting this album, I actually kind of enjoyed it while it was on. I'm not about to sit here and defend it and act as if it's an underappreciated classic that everyone's been sleeping on, because yes, this album is still a huge disappointment to me, but I won't pretend I didn't get some enjoyment out of it here and there. When Drake really zeroes in, focuses, and puts some effort into a track, it still sounds really damn good. And I think there are some genuinely good moments here that, even if they aren't top tier in Drake's discography, feel thoroughly enjoyable to me. I counted 12 tracks out of 21 that I enjoyed from this project, which actually feels like a decent amount for one of Drake's more unpopular releases. And maybe this is the I'm nicer to Drake's music than others part coming out, but yeah, in revisiting the album, I just was able to kind of at least enjoy myself while it was on, for the most part. With that said, I can't ignore the issues with this project. Just as there are good moments I very much vibe to, this album has some of Drake's absolute worst moments, and the lows are pretty damn low. I had a hard time figuring out where I'd rank this among Drake's projects, largely because of how rough those low points are. The album often swings wildly between having some tracks I'd call underrated in Drake's catalog to having some of the worst songs he's ever put out. And while he shows that he's still got it when he's hungry, there are just as many moments where he sounds like he's fucking around or leaving the features to carry tracks. That's another thing. This album is loaded with features, and as a result, it feels like they can make or break the project. Sometimes they save a song, other times they make it even worse. And yeah, I also validate the perspective that it feels like Drake showed no evolution with this project. There's a feeling here that Drake was kind of running out of ideas, as the only new thing he seemed to do here was get hornier and flex a bit more toxic masculinity than ever. Joy. So all in all, I see this as the point where Drake was truly running out of ideas, but I think there was at least enough to pull it together into something that was at least listenable. The problem is, it's still a Drake project, which means it's 21 tracks long and could have absolutely used a shave. Make this a 12-track album and you've got something solid out of Drake. Instead, we get 21 cuts where you never know if he's gonna flip the switch or fall asleep at the wheel, and it makes the project feel rather scatterbrained. His versatility was a little less on display as a result of his performances feeling a bit effortless, and as I said in my original review, it felt like Drake knew by this point that he reached the top and had no reasonable competition in his lane, so he just found himself asking, now what? So yeah, it's a disappointing record and a huge low point in Drake's catalog, but I don't hate it. I gave it an okay rating in my original review, and I can stick to that here. I would have even pressed on a very good rating, but the presence of Way Too Sexy and In the Bible alone was enough to hold this back. But all in all, it could have been a lot worse. Because who would have thought? It got worse. Because next, let's talk about his most recent solo studio album, Honestly Nevermind. Compared to the years-long wait and hype build-up for Certified Lover Boy, which may have also been compounded by his frequent beef with Kanye, this album came as a complete shock. Out of absolute nowhere, Drake popped up and announced the premiere of a new radio show and just casually announced his 7th studio album. And if I could be real, maybe this is the Drake defender in me that wants to see Drake do well, but I was excited for this album. Yes, people were memeing the cover art, and yes, there were question marks given the album's turn into being a full-blown dance record with house and club influence, but I was intrigued. I liked the singy R&B leaning Drake quite a bit, as you may have noticed throughout this whole video, so I was hopeful this would be a nice pivot, especially after seeing Drake finally shorten his track list. 14 songs in a studio album that's finally under an hour? Sign me up! But after listening to it, I regretted signing up because this is still my least favorite Drake project. This is a moment where I'm gonna start with the bad tracks before I get into the good, because there's a lot more bad than good here. The thing is, there's a short 30-something second intro track that, with its ambient and kind of spooky instrumental, raises the curiosity a bit like, ooh, where is this going? But then it leads into Falling Back, which is a rough starter to put it nicely. The dance instrumental kind of makes you go, okay, this is different. Then you realize Drake is singing with absolutely no structure to the point where he's just riffing, and then he tries jumping into his falsetto, only to sound absolutely ghastly in doing so. But if you thought it was bad, it only got worse. Look no further than Currents, which may very well be the worst song Drake's ever put out. Ironically, there are vocal moments I like here, especially on the chorus, but any bit of seriousness I could glean from the track is turned to shit by the bed squeaking beat and the bridge, which features what sounds like Drake basically moaning? Which, by the way, if that is Drake and he is moaning, how does he even sound emotionless when he moans? He's literally like, like, Jesus, I am not a sexually active person, but if I was, and someone was moaning like that, I don't think I'd even be able to finish. I'd run away and never come back. I'd probably be too personally offended to ever want to see the person again. But what do I expect from a dude who made a song like Calling My Name? A nondescript track that I'd have forgotten about if not for the utterly ridiculous, "Your pussy is calling my name." Don't know if he thought he was getting zesty on us, but he wasn't. The saddest part is that the first half of the song actually starts off kinda nicely, but then it devolves into that nonsense. I'm led to believe that someone involved in this album's creative process, if not Drake himself, actively wanted this record to sabotage his career. It hasn't done that, but I mean, it still sucks, so job well done. Downhill feels like a somewhat normal turn back into Drake's R&B sound, but with an utterly boring chorus and post-chorus despite decent vocals from Bo Knox. It makes this feel like one of the most limp songs on the entire project. And Liability is an utterly miserable, absolutely boring-ass song that goes for a deeper voiced, reverb-heavy vocal style but does nothing more than make me want to fall asleep. Sticky serves as a slightly more tolerable moment on the project, if for no reason other than that it sees Drake back in the hip-hop style, but his emotionless tone and ridiculous lyrics make this mostly a whatever for me. Overdrive has a little bit of unique guitar integration, but it's got a rather unenthusiastic chorus and doesn't really stick out much in a good or bad way compared to many other tracks here. Tie That Binds also has a few decent ideas and doesn't sound bad for the most part, but then Drake comes in with that, "Oh baby," and the flamenco guitar just throws everything off. Now, I will say I did enjoy a few tracks from this record. I can't lie, I've gotten a fair bit of mileage out of Text Go Green, if for not much other than it actually has some well put together vocal melodies that match the dance instrumental pretty well, even if yes, it is a bit weird to hear Drake bark at me at the beginning of the hook. A Keeper also has some smooth, low-key vibes that work in spite of some of the repetition of the chorus. Massive does a pretty good job with its more energetic production, interesting beat switch-ups, and stronger structured Drake vocals. And Flight's Book takes off thanks to it having one of the album's better hooks along with an amazingly integrated sample of Getting Late by Flowetry. And of course, Jimmy Cooks with 21 Savage is a strong reprieve, leaning back into the hip-hop sounds and seeing both Drake and 21 doing pretty well with a sinister beat that also has a strong switch at the halfway mark. But sadly, it's one of those tracks that just makes you scream, "Where was this?" by the time you're done the album. And that's always the worst feeling. Yeah, this is still Drake's worst. It's a truly miserable album, and the saddest part is that it really could have been great. Conceptually, I don't mind the idea of a fully R&B singy Drake album. Genuinely, I myself could take about 14 singy tracks from Drake's early projects, put it together in the form of an album, and it could come out amazing. Imagine a Drake album that had a combination of tracks like Brand New, Shut It Down, I Get Lonely, Marvin's Room, Doing It Wrong, Come Through, Jungle. An album like that would hit in all kinds of ways. So to me, as someone who enjoys that side of Drake, I feel like a dance record that leans more on his singing in theory doesn't sound too bad. And hell, 14 tracks? Here's me thinking Drake would finally give us a project that doesn't feel overly bloated with unnecessary filler. The problem is Drake at this point in his career can't shake the feeling that he sounds absolutely checked out almost every time he opens his mouth on a song, and the few times where he doesn't sound checked out, he comes through with cringeworthy vocal performances like with that ugly falsetto or that "you're a pussy" nonsense. It's like on these last few albums between the strange cover arts and cringy Drake moments, he's becoming a reflection of what he thinks people think of him. Sometimes self-awareness can help take the sting off and make the artist feel like they're in on the joke, but other times it makes them look insecure and desperate. It feels like a lot of Drake's recent attempts at self-awareness fall into the latter category, making him seem insecure of what he thinks people think of him. And even the shortened track list doesn't help, because quite a few of the songs, even the high points, are longer to compensate, and they feel like they just linger for way too much time. It's a woeful record that squanders an interesting soundscape and good production on weak-ass performances, and then Drake had to come in and say we didn't get it. Like, no, we got it, dude. You made a nondescript dance album, sounded bored as hell for most of it, probably had a bunch of yes people around you making it sound like you created the greatest music of all time, and then dropped it. For a dude who once had an album called Take Care, it feels like that's the one thing he's not doing when it comes to the quality of his recent music. Taking care of it. Drake tries his hardest to convince us that he still works hard, but I guess he forgot that it's better to work smarter, not harder. And sadly, with Honestly Nevermind, it sounds like he wasn't working smarter or harder. I gave it an awful when I first reviewed it, and I'd still give it an awful. Still the only Drake. It is Drake, I'll give it that. Still the only Drake record I've given that rating to, and still a huge low point for him. Especially given that this should have been a slam dunk. Given that he's from Toronto, this should have been Joe Carter in the 1993 World Series. But instead, it was the 2022 Wildcard Series, Game 2, an 8-1 lead unthinkably blown. The Six's biggest artist tried his hand at a dance album, but it was the Seattle Mariners who would be dancing on Toronto's home turf. And it sure as hell wasn't to this album. And lastly, we have the most recent project that Drake's been a part of, his collaborative album with 21 Savage, Her Loss. To me, a record like this seemed at least like a decent idea. Drake and 21 had been putting out some pretty good collaborations with tracks like Mr. Right Now, Knife Talk, and Jimmy Cooks, the latter of which was almost universally considered the best track on Honestly Nevermind, and to some the only good song. In my eyes, as much as some people have wanted a What a Time to Be Alive 2, I was more ready for a collab with 21 than another Drake X Future tape. Hell, if Drake really wanted to excite me with a collab project, drop a tape with Rick Ross. They're a pretty damn strong duo. But regardless, a 21 and Drake project sounded like it would at least be an improvement over Honestly Nevermind, and well, yeah, it was. Granted, Eating Dirt might have been an improvement over Honestly Nevermind, but yeah, this was, if nothing else, better. Even with a weird marketing campaign, a number of controversies, and another very strange cover, this turned out to be at least a passable record, even if it was nothing special. And that's how I felt about it when re-listening to it for this video. As again, there are some tracks I can at the very least get behind. Spin 'Bout You, for example, is probably the song I've returned to the most, what with its sample that for some reason gives me the feeling of a Trilogy-era Weekend track, along with 21 Savage leading the charge nicely. Drake also managed to do just enough with his performance and also had some solid singing on the hook. Sure, some of the lyrics are a bit weird and maybe kind of awkward, but I mean, hey, there's enough self-aware sexism on the album that I feel like I'm already asking for too much. Treacherous Twin has some nice dark banging production with solid singing from Drake and a more subdued performance from 21 Savage, and Pussy and Million succeeds largely thanks to the old school feel of the instrumental combined with that slick beat switch when Travis Scott comes in. It's nothing amazing, but compared to everything else, at least it's kind of memorable. And the album does end on a solid 3-track run with the sinister Metro Boomin produced banger More M's, where 21 gets a chance to take the lead. The very mellow, soulful sampling 21 Savage solo song 3 AM on Glenwood. Nice of Drake to let someone else have an AM/PM track on this album. And the lighter solo Drake song, I Guess It's Fuck Me, that gets to see him give more of a downbeat, sing-rappy, introspective song compared to a lot of what else is here. Sadly, to me, there is a fair amount on this record that went in through one ear and left out the other. For as much as Rich Flex became one of the album's biggest singles, it's not a song I really care that much to go back to. That meme where it sounds like Drake is flirting with 21 Savage on the intro was one of the only things I really remembered about it. I see how others enjoyed it, but very little about it stood out to me personally. Major Distribution, despite its slick, tiptoeing dark beat, lacks much in the way of a strong hook and just feels like one of the most It Exists songs on the album. On BS has a nothing burger of a chorus, a standard beat, and some pretty weak bars, like the dancing around the Pusha T situation and the fact that he may have dissed XXXTentacion for some reason. The hypocritically titled Privileged Rappers, because that's essentially what Drake is at this point in his career, has some plucky instrumentation that I like, but Drake once again sounds checked out, leaving 21 Savage to do the heavy lifting. Hours in Silence is another moment of 36-year-old Drake talking about nutting, exacerbated by the fact that this is a 6.5 minute long cut. Even though there are some nice singy moments, I actually like 21 Savage's filters on his vocals. The song absolutely didn't need to last as long as it did. Or if it did, give 21 more than literally 37 seconds on the song. Yes, I counted. Drake hogs the spotlight once again and makes me think this could have been a bit more interesting if he wasn't a kid yelling "My ball!" and not letting 21 play. Circle Loco is a track I should probably be more mad at, given given that it desecrates a song I absolutely love in One More Time by Daft Punk, but if nothing else, it's listenable while it's on thanks to the decent performances of Drake in 21, even though it's incredibly corny. Like that line that may or may not have been about Megan Thee Stallion, the way he interpolates the hook of One More Time. Terribly, might I add. And would you just turn Drake up already so he could stop asking to be turned up? Broke Boys is another slow burner that pretty much bores me while featuring one of the record's weakest choruses, not really doing anything interesting until the second part of the song. And once again, Drake is the only one who gets the rap on the second half, which doesn't help with the whole he's a ball hog on this album thing for me. And then beyond the previously mentioned I guess it's fuck me, Drake gets 3 more solo tracks in Back Outside Boys, Middle of the Ocean, and Jumbotron Shit Poppin'. The first of those 3, Back Outside Boys, is probably the biggest stinker to me. Whatever Drake was trying to do here doesn't work for me. I don't know whether to call it a Lil Baby flow or something like that, but his awkwardness and lack of energy really bring this down a lot and make it a track I absolutely could have lived without. As for the other 2, Middle of the Ocean is boring as hell, with Drake slow flowing and long pausing on a track that for some reason is almost 6 minutes, and wouldn't be worth anything outside of that random diss to Serena Williams' husband Alexis Ohanian. Meanwhile, Jumbotron Shit Poppin' starts promising with that really cool vocal sample on the intro, but then it turns a bit forgettable when the instrumental doesn't really go with it and Drake just kind of sing reps. And honestly, on the opposite side of things compared to Middle of the Ocean, this one is too short, being just over 2 minutes with 1 verse. You really couldn't let 21 on this song at all. All in all though, Her Loss is a huge improvement over Honestly Nevermind, though it still feels like it's very much on the low end for Drake's discography. I personally enjoy it much more as a collab project than What a Time to Be Alive, but I think it comes from the fact that Drake and 21 are a better combination to me than Drake and Future. And again, it really succeeds by way of being lifted by 21 Savage. I feel like he has more consistently solid performances to make him a bit more interesting. Unfortunately, Drake kinda hogs the attention on this project. It feels less like a collab album and more like a Drake album where most of the songs happen to have 21 Savage on them. Combine that with the weak hooks and occasionally poor writing on Drake's end, and this ends up rather forgettable. I'd even say most of the improvement over Honestly Nevermind comes by way of this having less lowlights. The good moments on that album surprisingly feel a bit more memorable to me, but it so happens that the low points are even worse. With Her Loss, most of the tracks are just kind of fine, so it makes the record feel a bit more listenable in that regard. It's a type of thing that's alright while it's on, even if nothing comes close to being amazing in the context of Drake's discography. Drake's lack of hunger just feels like it's a little less of a problem because he's got 21 Savage to mask his weaker performances a little. All in all though, it's just kind of fine to me. Nothing that's overly aggravating, but very little that gets me super hyped. I gave it an okay rating in my original review, and once again, I can stick to that rating. Passable enough, but not even the best hip-hop collab album of 2022 in my opinion. So after all these projects, I'll say that Drake has absolutely had his ups and downs, and no doubt has been on a cold streak with his last few records. With that said, going through all of his albums in succession actually proved to be pretty fun. He's definitely put out a lot of music I really enjoy, and it was fun to get to re-experience a lot of it, no matter how much of it grew on me. Even on his worst projects, Drake can always come through with something really impressive every once in a while, and his incredible potential makes him a little bit easier to stomach. And while records like Honestly Nevermind and Her Loss do precious little for me, I can always go back to Take Care, and if you're reading this it's too late, for a good reminder of how great Drake can be. And hell, even with more middling projects like Nothing Was the Same and More Life, Drake can still put out some great tracks. And that mostly keeps me in Drake's corner because I know he still has it in him to put out a fantastic album on the level of If You're Reading This or Take Care. He just needs to bring that hunger back and keep the track lists as trimmed as he has on the last few projects. He could definitely get there, but for now, at least I'll be able to get a banger out of him every once in a while. But those are just my opinions on Drake's projects. What do you think of them? What are your favorites? What are your least favorites? What are the ones that you have the most experience with, least experience with? Have I convinced you to give him a second look on any of his projects? Whatever your thoughts, opinions, and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. And shit, this was a really long video. You won't see this part, but it was about 2.5 hours worth of raw footage that I have to edit down now. Whether this continues to become a series in the future, I have no idea. Again, the next video that I'm going to make that's going to be long form is probably going to be the update video on what's been going on and how I've been feeling about the channel lately. I'm probably going to wait to do that a little bit because this video just took a lot of time to film, so I want to edit it, get it uploaded, and then just take a quick second to breathe. But either way, I'll give you guys an update on what's been going on with the channel and things like that in the future. Thank you guys again for being patient with this video. I'll try not to keep you guys waiting for that update. Stay tuned for that, but until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. As I just said a second ago, thank you guys for being patient with this video. I know it took me a really long time. There were points where I didn't even think I was actually going to be able to get through it, but thankfully I did. So hopefully you guys got some enjoyment out of it. I am gonna go sleep now because I am tired and I need to rest. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.